I will say just a few words before introducing our panelists. So first, I would say that many of us were drawn to do research on the topic, but really focus of this meeting, out of a desire to inform the design of policies that are potentially important determinants of long-term macroeconomic outcomes like productivity and growth. But if you look at our meeting schedules over the year, many of us, myself included, tend to focus on more microeconomic studies. And I think oftentimes that leaves a gap between the evidence that we as economists that work on these topics are producing and the macroeconomic quantifications that are needed to inform key economic policy debates. And that's one reason why I was so enthusiastic about both the papers that were on the afternoon schedule, because I think if you look at the literature that we've produced, it's a lot of interesting and striking and compelling microeconomic evidence on factors like knowledge spillovers, but making the jump to connecting those kinds of spillovers to total factor productivity growth and doing that quantification of the macroeconomic aggregates is something that not a lot of us have done. And I think both of those papers are just really well-crafted, thoughtfully compiled attempts to connect the dots and stitch together the micro evidence more in our own paper with the macro aggregates, more like in Furman and Andrew's paper that are needed in these policy discussions. The second thing I would say is, so Ben Jones was someone that I've looked up to for a long time, including when he spent time at Treasury and at the Council of Economic Advisors. And I remember he would often reflect on his time serving in this position in Washington as saying, it was striking to him that when he went to Washington, D.C., it was no one's job to think about productivity. And that was always striking to me for several reasons. One is I think it captures something important about time horizons, kind of what ends up kind of being urgent issues relative to these kind of longer term issues, but also just something about job descriptions of kind of, in the same way that we have departments, microeconomists, macroeconomists, and people that work on healthcare, productivity is something that doesn't always fit naturally into someone's job description. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited to have this panel, especially the follow-on on the two papers that we have assigned, to kind of connect some of the work that we do as economists to these budgetary and macroeconomic issues related to productivity. So rather than doing long and proper introductions of our panelists, I'm just going to introduce each of them extremely briefly. Jason Furman is currently a professor at Harvard. He's had two previous jobs to this, but I will just say that we thought to invite him because of his experience and expertise in various executive branch positions of the federal government, including time as the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors and as deputy director of the National Economic Council. Next to Jason is Marron, who's from the Institute College or Urban Institute. Like Jason, who had too many jobs. So I will just say that we thought to invite him because of his experience and expertise in various legislative branch of the federal government, including time as the deputy director and acting director of the National Budget Office, as well as time with Congress's Joint Economic Committee. Rampell, who will include third, is a journalist, producer with the New York Times, currently an opinion columnist with the Washington Post, and who also thinking about stories about the economy for PBS NewsHour. I will slightly overstep the fully fact-based introductions that I gave for Jason and Donald, and just share that after fact-checking the claim and to the former journalist, I think it's fair to say Catherine is broadly appreciated to be one of the most thoughtful and well-respected economic journalists of her generation, producing work that has had and continues to have a really important impact on some of the most important public debates related to innovation and productivity. So we'll let each of our panelists speak for up to 15 minutes. I'm happy to do shorter if you'd like to, and then open it up for moderated Q&A. So Jason, please go ahead.
Great. Well, thanks, Heidi, for organizing this. All of you for being here. And I agree with everything you said about Catherine. So I was, when I was in the government at CEA, I was headed once to a talk at the University of Chicago, and there was stuck in traffic and came up with an idea for the talk that it would be good to illustrate the importance of both reducing inequality and increasing productivity by doing a thought experiment. And so I sent the parameters of the thought experiment back to an RA to give me the answer. And I was pretty sure the answer was going to be about 50-50 between those two forces. And the thought experiment was this, that median household income grew at about a 3% annual rate prior to 1973. that pace, as everyone in this room knows, incomes double once a generation. Since then, median household income has grown at something more like half a point a year. And at that pace, it's every 150 years or something that it doubles. We're still making progress. We're still moving forward. We're just not moving forward at the pace they were. And so the thought experiment, and it's just a thought experiment, it's not like an actual policy that you could do, is what would have happened if we had continued the productivity growth prior to 1973 and the 25 years before it, without, so there's no productivity slowdown, but inequality continued to increase the way it did otherwise. And versus what would happen if you did have the productivity slowdown, but inequality had never increased. Anyway, the answer came back, and when I do the most recent version of it, it turns out about 85% of the slowdown in income growth I just talked about was because of the slowdown in productivity. And only about 1/6 of it is due to the increase in inequality. And it was just much more skewed than what I even had in my own head. Now, some of it should be decently obvious. If you look at something like the top 90% share of income, it used to be something like 60% and it went down to 50%. So if you went from 50 to 60, you go up 20%. Whereas productivity growth has slowed by about a percentage point a year. Accumulate that over 50 years and you're at 65, 70% growth or something like that. So if I'd taken even that moment, I would have figured that out. So after that, I started talking quite a lot, placed, frankly, more emphasis on productivity in solving what I see as one of the central economic problems, which is that slowdown of median household income. Now, there's a lot of other things that innovation matters for, like climate change, disease, and the like. But that issue, I think it's quite, started sort of emphasizing it more. And in some respects, there is a reason why that makes sense. I like tax and transfer policies quite a lot. If you want to change the incomes of the bottom 20%, you can raise them by 20, 30, 40%. It doesn't cost that much money. To do anything like that for the middle fifth just costs a prohibitively enormous amount of money, to the point where you're probably even running into a Laffer curve in terms of how much money could come from the rich to pay for it. There's another set of tools which are distributional tools. Expanding the minimum wage might do things for people at the bottom. It's not going to do anything for anyone in the middle. Expanding labor unions, we're at less than 10% unionization in the United States. Probably the median person isn't going to be very affected by that. And you can go through non-competes, et cetera, all the different things we've emphasized on labor market monopsony. I think you'd be sort of hard pressed to quantify any of that to have any type of very, very large impact on the median household. That doesn't mean, by the way, I wouldn't do it. In fact, I do an awful lot of those things. I leave no stone unturned in dealing with the slowdown. But it's pretty hard to get around that, again, especially for sort of the middle, that there aren't many policy instruments. Now, that raises a question that if we went through this room and did a survey of should NSF funding go up or down, should NIH funding go up or down, should, when they did the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which was aimed at growth, should they have raised or lowered the marginal tax rate on R&D? And by the way, in case you didn't know, they actually raised the effective marginal tax rate on R&D, even though they cut the marginal tax rate on every other form of less innovative investment. Should we have more immigration of people with high skills, or more immigration across the board? Should we do a whole bunch of other things? I think like the vote in this room would probably be something like 100 to 0. Then we have to ask why the vote in the political system is nowhere near close to 100 to 0. why that thought experiment I began with, which isn't exactly the policy relevant thought experiment, because it doesn't answer the question of do you have a tool that can raise productivity by 1 percentage point, but I view it as a motivating thing. If you could do that, it could accomplish all that. Why is this something that we're just so far from what this room would think is optimum? I think much further than most other areas of economic policy. The NBER is less politically balanced than it was 30 years ago, but if you went into a room on taxes, certainly 30 years ago, maybe now, some people would want like the top tax rate to be even higher. Some people would want it to be even lower. You weren't way far away from what the median view in the room would be. And you certainly wouldn't have unanimity on one side of that. You could go through a range of other economic questions. Some of them, this isn't the only one. There are things like carbon taxes, which also would pass here 100 to 0. And in the political system, it's not that. So why? Because I think this was on political economy and okay, good. I can keep talking about that. Good. So why is that? Now, part of it may be that people don't understand. And so the remedy for this is doing better research on the enormous returns to public R&D. Part of it may be that they don't understand the links between productivity and wages. I teach the intro class at 10 at Harvard, and I find at the end of the year, slightly distressed that I find more than half of my students, even though we've gone through how labor markets work and all of that, basically resort to employers pay people more if they're nice and benevolent type of view of the world. And in that view of the world, if you get more productivity, you'll keep it for yourself in the form of higher profits. And there's no reason that productivity should translate into anyone's pay, except maybe for the occasional employer that's sort of nice. And the Economic Policy Institute had that chart, or still has that chart, of productivity going this way and compensation going that way. And there's 8 million problems with, they're indexed in different ways. And the EPI people that did that chart know that. But I think the biggest problem is that implies something that a lot of people actually sort of believe, that these two things, compensation and productivity, are just determined completely independently of each other. And if somehow you made the productivity line go up faster, you wouldn't be making the compensation line go up faster. So I think that is a way in which, for whatever reason, people more atavistically, unless they've been trained or overtrained, paid enough attention in my class, just sort of believe in a bit of a zero-sum / corporations can do whatever they want view of the world. So the idea that these income problems are tied to things like distribution is a lot more intuitive, I think, for many people than that it's tied to things like aggregate productivity. There's another part of it, though. Sometimes when things don't happen the way you want to, it isn't because people don't understand it well enough and you need to explain it to them clearly, but it's because maybe they do understand it well enough and they just have a different social welfare function than you do. Not entirely sure how that applies here. I mean, I think part of it is the awkward tension, and I think I've learned a bunch of this from Catherine's columns, and I think she'll probably talk about it more, between what you want to do to increase innovation, which has all these medium and long-term benefits. I focused on income, but we could talk about climate change, disease, et cetera, and what the immediate sort of distributional or whatever impact of what you're doing today is. So if you want to cure cancer, I think to a first approximation, you probably want to send all of your research funding here to the Boston area. And most of that research funding will go not just to one part of the country, but it will go to people in the top 10, 5% of the income distribution within the Boston area. As somebody who would sort of love whatever cancer I might eventually get to be cured before I get it, that doesn't bother me in the slightest. In fact, it would bother me quite a lot if the money was sent to people who would be less good at figuring out how to cure whatever type of cancer I'll eventually come up with. But I sort of get that everything I just said was a little bit about my industry, or the sort of very near cousin of my industry, about my neighborhood and the like. You had John Gruber and Simon Johnson that came up with this proposal to spread research funding all across the country and to dramatically increase it. I thought the intelligent defense of their proposal, and sometimes I thought they believed it this way, and sometimes I thought they believed something else, was that the dollars would be 90% less effective, but there would be 5 times more of them. And I'm all for making political compromises where you do things less well, but you can do them at a larger scale. I think it's possible that they thought it would be better if you spread the money around, and I think that's possible. I think it's a little bit unlikely, and this gets to, again, I think something Catherine will probably talk about, of where if you want to do something, sort of focus on doing that thing, not trying to accomplish a lot of goals at once. But maybe that does have some tension with being able to pass something through the political system and get it done. Another part of this is just a lot of these gains are in the future. And I don't know if it's that people rationally have high discount rates and can't understand that maybe even the beta on this innovation is negative, because it pays off in the terrible states of the world. That must be true, especially for things like climate change. And so we want tons of it, or that's just, or that's just something else. I don't know what the other impediments are politically. I tried to think of a more compelling list, frankly, for this, and I couldn't. The one thing I think it's not, even though maybe it's worth doing, some people have process solutions. I read a proposal recently that there needed to be a new council in the White House for innovation to compete with China. And I can tell you from my experience that you would always rather have a director of the NEC who believed in something with a deputy who is skilled than to create a new council where the head of that new council is not in the chief of staff's morning meeting, can't get a meeting with the ledge director, and can't get things done. So it's some of the rearranging process, council, et cetera, solutions, I think, are what you do when you don't really have a better idea. Right now, I don't have necessarily a better idea other than continuing to repeat my thought experiment, continue to encourage all of this research, and to say, on the one hand, resist these things where you're wasting money in ways that have these trade-offs because you're accomplishing these other goals. But on the other hand, when you can get much more money because of them, maybe hold your nose and do it, and try to be sure you know the distinction between those. The last thing I want to bring up is the one way in which this debate is different today than when I was in the White House nearly 8 years ago is the role that China plays, I think, objectively in the world, and certainly in the mindsets of policymakers in Washington and voters, is quite different than what it was back then. This is the way that the CHIPS Act got passed, which everyone in this room will have different opinions on. I think it's less about cutting edge innovation of the type that is going to raise middle class incomes eventually that I talked about, and more about national security and resilience, but it's something. And there was a bunch of other money authorized in it that hasn't been appropriated that probably would be more for innovation. But this conflict with China does raise, I think, new opportunities both for framing things and for actually getting things done. And I think part of the trick for the analytic community will be to figure out ways to harness that in the right way, insofar as it, for example, reduces scientific dialogue and back and forth. Some of that may actually be justified on national security grounds, but it's almost never going to be justified on innovation grounds. So that's yet another place where one can try to harness the innovation train to this issue, but really quite carefully, because one, not everything in it is innovation, and not everything should be, because it's not the only objective we have. So that would be the last part of what we think about, but I'm sure that the other panelists know all of the answers, so I will listen to them with interest.
So hi, pleasure to be here. I guess after that lead-in, I have to sadly say I do not have answers here today. I bring you questions and framing. So I've spent the last 20 plus years working in economic policy in Washington. I've worked 2 rounds for Congress, 2 rounds in the White House, and now quite a while at the Urban Institute in sort of the think tank research organization world. And building on some of the things that Jason said, one of the things that's striking is that if you live in that environment doing economic policy, there is just an enormous sea of things that cross your desk that are described as policies to improve innovation and particularly to improve productivity. And the cynical take on that is that everyone wants to be pro-innovation and pro-productivity, at least some of the time. And then therefore they take their proposals and will try to find some way to wrap it in that claim, at least for some audiences. But the more serious and I think sincere take on that is actually there are a whole bunch of policy levers that in principle one might pull on in order to encourage innovation and to boost productivity. Sabrina Howell earlier had a very nice 4-part summary of what you might think of as fiscal policy tools, right? So you can think about the federal government as actually like using its resources to go do R&D. You can think of it as funding R&D by people in the private sector, whether for profit or not profit. You can think of it as using its procurement power to basically create incentives and point to the direction of innovation's era. And you can think about its tax and spending powers as a separate kind of tool to influence what kind of innovative activity takes place. So already there you've got a lot of richness to think about what works, what doesn't, what's cool, what's not. But then when you open the box further, and Jason mentioned many of these, there are a whole bunch of other levers, right? So there are things in labor policy, right? How do you think about immigration and STEM and high skills and all of that? There'll be a paper tomorrow morning about non-competes, right? It's not just about creating ideas, right? It's about having the ideas percolate around and meet with each other and create new ideas. And how do you encourage that? Whole set of issues around intellectual property protections. What's too hot? What's too tight? What's too loose? If you operate in this world, you also begin to hear arguments about the children, which again, I like these are real sincere things, right? If you can improve the lives of children today, both the education they get and their health today, at some point in the future, they're going to be more productive members of society, and that presumably will have some innovative effect. Perhaps a hard one to estimate, but something real to consider. And on. And issues about just capital accumulation, tax code, all those kinds of things. And so, if you put on your sort of, philosopher king social planner hat, I guess I should say philosopher royalty social planner hat, it's really, really useful in the policy world to have like a rank order list of bang per buck of everything I just named and everything omitted. And so please produce that. But then taking Jason's point, which is there's like a whole political economic overlay on this that doesn't necessarily seem to bring to the surface things that the nerds, which is a word I use lovingly, like think are best. There's sort of the political economy thing of, politics is the art of the possible, right? And when you have lots of levers to put on, at any given moment, you may find that some have more traction than others. And they might not be your first best or your second best, but in practice and policy, if you have something that's a good third best option, that's probably pretty good. Not always, right? But something to certainly have in your toolkit, particularly if the moment arises when it can be used. The second point I want to make, really, really different, is so by far my favorite job ever was I got to spend a year as the acting director of the Congressional Budget Office. Which I describe as 9 out of 10 days, it is the best job for an economist in the world, where you're working with wonderful people doing sincere analysis, trying to inform America's representatives about the implications of the economic policies they propose. The other day, some member of Congress is denouncing you in public, and it's not so great. But 9 of them, it's the greatest, and there are a bunch of CBO people here in the audience. And so I suspect all of you are familiar with CBO, but I did just want to say a little bit about their role in the system and about their role as consumers of the type of work that you produce, which is that CBO's formal role is to analyze the budget effects of proposed legislation. And then that expands a bit to also doing research on behalf of members of Congress about the economic effects of proposed legislation and possible policy changes. And they take a very serious, rigorous approach to that, right? So they try to figure out what the effects of policy are going to be. In what they do, which is called conventional scoring, sometimes called static, which is incorrect, but in conventional scoring, They don't take into account what might happen at the macroeconomy level, but they still take into account many of the things that people here in this room analyze, right? Which is if you make a change to some R&D policy, do you get more or less R&D? And they will incorporate that in their budget score. They will communicate that kind of information to Congress. In certain cases, they then go further and do what's called dynamic scoring, where they take into account what are going to be the effects on GDP and other macroeconomic aggregates, and then how does that flow through other aspects of fiscal policy into taxes and spending. There is a long-standing multi-decade debate about when is dynamic scoring appropriate, if ever. There's sort of the never do it camp. There's the do it only for taxes camp. And then there's the do it whenever the folks at CDO think that they can do it well camp. So I affiliate with the other, like the doing it only for taxes camp never made any sense to me. Like if you believe there are dynamic effects from policy, you ought to be analyzing all the policies that you can, subject to constraints, right? So there's a limit on the evidence we have available on that. And if you look at CDO's work in this area, you will see over the decades a change over time in how they approach things as more evidence has been produced by people like those in this room. There's a resource limit. Right, it turns out doing dynamic scoring of things is harder than conventional scoring, right? And so you have to add on things, it complicates things. And so you have to have some decision rules about when you do it, when you don't. Heidi has some interesting thoughts about how we should do that. I won't go into that now, but just, there's kind of resource issues. But in principle, it is very helpful for CBO to get information that guides not just their conventional scoring, but also what happens in the macroeconomy. They try very hard to incorporate that in their baseline estimates of what's going to happen to the economy over time. And when appropriate and when asked by members of Congress, they try to include that kind of information in their analysis of pending legislation. You probably all know this, but their standard deliverable is a 10-year budget estimate, right? So they look out over 10 years and they see what the budget implications are going to be in each, or estimate what the budget implications are going to be in each of those years. If you imagine yourself going back in time, there was a number when this was, 3 years, 5 years, right? There's a lot of concern that if you have too short a window, you're missing important things, right? We've gotten to 10, particularly when you talk about things like innovation, you could make a case that, wow, a lot of interesting stuff is happening out beyond year 10, but you do have to have some limit, right? Like some of you may remember the old joke about razor blades, about how they're going to go from 1 to 2 to 3 blades, and then eventually 666, and the world is going to end. Like at some point, the window over which you analyze things becomes hard, but maybe you do it. CBO currently does things outside the 10-year window with a little less precision. For example, they do some 30-year projections. But so there's a set of issues of how far you can go out. But CBO does its best to bring this kind of information and help and inform the budget estimates and associated studies for Congress, which really are influential, right? So the reason I'm making this point is there are economists in Washington taking this kind of work, incorporating in models, who actually do have some influence over the process. Not exclusive, nor should they have exclusive, right? Because the world is not actually about the budget, right? The world should be about something like, some measure of social welfare, but they're very influential. And then the third point I want to make just very quickly is one of the reasons CBO is such a jewel is that by the standards of a government agency, it is astoundingly transparent. We could have a conversation about how it could be even more transparent, but I want you to judge it against a benchmark of every other government agency you've ever dealt with. And one of their recent innovations in the past few years in their transparency is actually to publish things asking or outlining what kind of economic research would be useful for the work they do for Congress. And so to the extent you or your students or people want to do policy relevant research, it's an interesting laundry list of things that are on their mind. And so they have a very nice paper in the recent Journal of Economic Perspectives. I highly recommend it to you. I just wanted to highlight a couple of things. So the first is immigration is a hot issue, and there's a really, really interesting issue about how immigration affects TFP growth. And so you can imagine, right, the skills of the people come in, the knowledge they bring, the networks, whatever. So data on that, inside evidence on that is very important for them. Obviously, the topics of the last two panels, right, direct federal policies that try to promote innovation, what are the effects of those are of great interest. There's a very interesting, I guess you'd call it mathematical issue about, I was brought up in a tradition of thinking about innovation and growth in exponential terms, but there is now a little bit of discussion and debate about when things are actually arithmetic rather than geometric. And if you think about the people at CBO who try to do things year by year over 10 years and sometimes 30 years, it turns out arithmetic versus geometric is actually a really big deal. And so they're interested in that. And then finally, just drawing on something I saw in the two presentations earlier, preceding this, remember CBO stock and trade or 10-year cost estimates. So it is really, really useful for them not to just get tables of numbers that have point estimates of some effect at some particular point in time, but to the extent you can sincerely estimate impulse response functions that show them a shape that they might hypothetically include in their 10-year estimates, that's incredibly helpful. Thanks.
Thanks so much for having me. I am an op-ed columnist at the Washington Post, as you heard, and there is a stereotype about op-ed columnists, one of many, that we always quote our Uber drivers. Because like that's the only time we come in contact with the common man because we are so out of touch and obnoxious. I'm not going to do that, don't worry. I'm going to tell a story that's even more obnoxious because it was set at a DC cocktail party. Back in April, I was attending a pre-White House Correspondents' Dinner cocktail party. I told you it was obnoxious. And I happened to see someone there from the Biden administration who works on economic policy, someone whose side I have sometimes been a thorn in. And I think that's largely because I'm generally viewed as somewhat left of center. And the folks in the White House maybe assumed that that would mean that I would be more of a cheerleader for Biden's economic agenda, and I haven't always been, to put it mildly. And so I'm having a nice conversation with this person, kind of trying to smooth things over. And then a colleague of mine from the Washington Post comes over, and this is somebody who is generally seen as very conservative. I introduce them. My colleague says, "Oh, so you two must see eye to eye on those things." And this Biden official and I kind of like look at each other and laugh nervously. And I said, "Well, you know, I'm a little bit more conservative on some things." And my colleague says, "Really? Like what?" And I said, "Well, you know, I'm a little more pro-trade. I'm a little bit more a fan of thinking about comparative advantage and a little more skeptical of industrial policy." And my colleague says, "Wait, is that conservative?" Which is a fair question right now, because both parties, and particularly the sort of further extremes of both parties, have become considerably more protectionist and more pro-industrial policy over time. And I think there are a number of ways to explain why that has happened. Some of it is specific to trade and mistakes made, I think, in the execution of trade policies, not compensating the losers of trade, for example. There's also been a rise in economic nationalism around the world in the decade plus after the financial crisis. But I think a lot of it has to do with the refusal to acknowledge, let alone make decisions based on trade-offs, the very concept of trade-offs. There is an assumption among economic policymakers that every goal is mutually reinforcing of every other goal. So like any given industrial policy will, secure access to critical technology to protect national security, like Jason was talking about, but also curb climate change, and also, create more childcare, and also beat China and lower prices for consumers. It's not even like a double dividend, it's a septuple dividend. But the most important thing that every policy has to do is it has to create jobs. Especially good union construction jobs, good union manufacturing jobs. Every program is a jobs program. And in some ways, this approach is not just sort of indifferent to productivity growth in the way that Heidi was talking about. It is like actively hostile to it, right? People in this room might think that the dollars that have been appropriated for infrastructure, for semiconductors, et cetera, should be used to try to build as many bridges and chip fabs and solar panels and batteries and wind turbines as possible. But the big secret is that if you do that, that means like using as few inputs as possible to get as much output as possible, and some of that input is jobs. And so, you know, saying that you're gonna not create that many jobs or even as few jobs as possible is really not a popular thing to enact if you're a politician, even if you're in an economy with at or close to full employment. That's like what's wildest about all of this, that everything still has to be a jobs program. And so every program has to achieve everything a little bit, which of course can mean achieving none of them particularly well. And I'm not the first one to observe this, this problem with industrial policy making, or the approach right now within the United States. Ezra Klein, who's at the New York Times, has referred to it as the everything bagel approach, which is a nice metaphor, but actually I don't particularly like it because I think everything bagels are delicious. And maybe there is some sense in which like the poppy seeds and the sesame seeds and the salt and everything else like are mutually flavor inducing. My preferred analogy is a turducken. Do you folks know what a turducken is? I think of this as like sort of a uniquely American thing. I don't know if it actually is, but it's for anyone who doesn't, it's this concoction where people cook a chicken inside a duck inside a turkey. And you know, probably went viral on social media at some point. But I like that as the analogy because like if you're cooking all the things together, you're probably not optimizing the temperature for any one of them, and then you just get something that's kind of like undercooked here and overcooked here, and it's just maybe going to make you sick. I don't know. So let me give you some examples of the kinds of policies that I mean. A few months ago, President Biden announced a set of new tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, solar panels, and batteries, amongst other technologies. And if you remember the person from the obnoxious cocktail party that I mentioned, this person gave me a call in advance of that policy being announced to sort of sell it to me. And as you can guess, I was somewhat skeptical, but I do understand that our relationship with China is complicated. And, you know, that's something that we have to consider when thinking about setting these kinds of trade-related policies. But I've also heard Biden say many times that climate change is an existential crisis. So that's basically what I asked this person. I said, if climate change is an existential crisis, why would we do anything to make EVs, batteries, and solar more expensive and thereby slow adoption? And I expected a response along the lines of, look, you know, we know it's going to increase costs, but we think it's worth the cost because of the threat to our industrial base, or the threat to national security from China controlling these important supply chains, or maybe even worries about human rights and slave labor, or what have you. You know, I might personally weight some of those factors a little bit differently, more or less than people in the administration, but I would understand if that was the explanation. Instead, the answer was, it won't raise costs. I'm not kidding. We will build up our own capacity, and therefore it won't raise costs. Like at what point, you know, what's the time frame for that? I don't know. Maybe the Earth will have cooked by then, but that's irrelevant. So that discussion was on background, meaning I can't tell you who said it, but there are Biden officials who have said very substantially similar comments on the record. So on this day that these tariffs were announced, there was a White House press conference, and U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai was speaking, and she was asked, here, I'm just going to read from the transcript, quote from a reporter, when Trump hiked tariffs on Chinese goods, it led to some increased prices for U.S. customers. How can we be sure the same thing won't happen again? Ambassador Tai. First of all, I think that link in terms of tariffs to prices has been largely debunked. I didn't expect that to get less. And then she goes on to talk about like the importance of supply chain resilience, blah, blah. So like my main objection here, as you can imagine, is that there didn't seem to be any attempt, at least not publicly, to do a formal cost benefit analysis and talk through like what we're trying to optimize and what we're willing to sacrifice and how we would estimate the trade-offs. Even if the goal were only economic, we're only about job creation, it's still not clear that they did the cost benefit analysis correctly here, at least if you look at things like solar, because there are about 8 to 9 times as many solar-related jobs in the United States that depend on solar as an input than on making solar. So if you make solar panels more expensive, you put those downstream jobs at risk. That's like installation, maintenance, marketing, trade, etc., wholesale trade. There are other examples of this with the CHIPS Act that Jason mentioned. There were also some provisions that said that make money conditional on providing childcare to not only the workers at the chip fabs, but the construction workers who are making the chip fabs. And don't get me wrong, I am a big fan of expanding access to childcare. I've written about it many times, but I would much prefer that be done through like a program that is well thought out for how to structure a childcare program than to try to do it solely through this one industry. Especially since it's already really hard and expensive to build semiconductor plants in the United States relative to other countries, including ones that have pretty strong labor and environmental standards like Taiwan. But there's also this sort of lack of willingness to think about constraints of any kind. Biden officials will sometimes talk about crowding in investment, that's what they think that they're doing by paying companies, incentivizing companies to build more factories and other kinds of, critical innovations or infrastructure. And I guess to some extent, yeah, if you pay people to build more battery plants, they might build more battery plants, but you still need to think about the resource constraints here. So for example, there was an article in the FT last year that in the Columbus, Ohio area alone, it is the plant home for 2 new fabs and a battery plant. And those yet to be built projects will require around 10,000 construction workers. Sounds great, job creation program. The problem is there aren't enough skilled construction workers in the entire state of Ohio to build those plants, let alone for any other kind of construction activity that might utilize the same kinds of workers. There are similar problems with not thinking about permitting constraints with wind and solar development, among other kinds of infrastructure that I can get into, but that's a whole other can of worms. And to be clear, I've been picking on the Biden administration a bunch for this, but this is not a problem that is unique to Democrats or the progressive left. Trump and his surrogates also make very similar comments about tariffs all the time, that they are essentially a free lunch, they don't cost anything. Same thing with, their attempts to protect other favorite industries like coal, no trade-offs protecting coal jobs. If you look back at the kinds of regulatory changes that the Trump administration tried to put in place, often unsuccessfully, when Trump was president before, they were really good at cooking the books, like in the cost benefit analysis process, like, only counting the benefits and not counting the costs and throwing out various kinds of evidence. There are other people here who probably know more about it than I do, but, and more recently, Bob Lighthizer, who was Trump's U.S. Trade Representative and the newly named presumptive Republican vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, have talked about devaluing the dollar because that'll make our exports cheaper. What else will it do? There's some symmetric changes there that will affect our imports, and supposedly they care about prices for consumers, but we don't think about that. And of course, the whole long lore of tax cuts always paying for themselves are sort of like the trade-offless policy-making device, that you never have to think about constraints when you're cutting taxes, what you might have to do to offset it, because it always pays for itself. And, as Don can speak to better than I can, there may be growth effects, but for things like the TCJA, I don't think anybody has found that the Trump tax cuts in 2017, I don't think anybody's found that they really pay for themselves. And just to end on a bipartisan note, some of you may remember the bipartisan infrastructure deal that passed a couple of years ago with major support from both parties. Added a lot of additional spending to all sorts of infrastructure projects around the country, one of which was highway construction. The Federal Highway Administration has a quarterly index for highway project construction costs. And it includes material input prices like asphalt, it includes labor, shipping, overhead, traffic control, things like that. And if you look at just the raw nominal numbers before adjusting for this index, this cost index, from the last quarter of calendar year 2020 to the last quarter of calendar year 2023, it looks like spending went up quite a lot. It went up by about a third. But if you adjust for the higher prices that have been experienced, again, for the same inputs, actually spending went way down. Spending went down by about 20%. Because we didn't think about, well, I don't know if it's, you can say because we didn't think about, but we didn't think about the additional costs the additional price growth that went into this and how that might limit the ability to get as much bang for our buck. And so, my general view about all of this is like, policymakers made a bunch of mistakes before, obviously, on trade, on healthcare, and various other things, but I think we've kind of learned the wrong lessons from them. And people got mad at the bean counters, essentially, the people who were doing the cost benefit analysis, and we've just thrown it out the window. And we're no longer even trying to measure things, or at least certain contingents of both parties, I think, are no longer trying to measure things. This panel is supposed to be about productivity, I believe, and getting more bang for the buck. And we've sort of shifted away from getting more bang for the buck to getting as many bangs from the same buck, but maybe getting none of them at all. Those are my thoughts.
Glad you solved it.
Yes.
So I'm gonna give the panelists a chance to comment on anyone else's comments that they want to, and then I'll ask one question and we'll open it up. So Jason, do you have anything you'd like to?
Sure. This is partly restating what Catherine said, and then a tiny bit disagreeing a little bit, but it is only a little bit. So I think I've been in government. I've been involved in policies that were second best. I've been involved in policies that were third best, fourth, fifth, sixth. I've gone all the way to like 13. And I draw the line there. I will not do 14. It's stepped down before that. But what I think is important is that you do that eyes wide open, understanding what the better options were, understanding what and I don't think you disagree with this. It's probably not disagreeing at all. Understanding trade-offs and consequences. One place where, politicians always talk about jobs in public. That's something that's very hard to stop them from doing. When it's macro policy in a recession, you're sort of allowed to do that because you do actually get net jobs. But when you're at or near full employment, you basically shouldn't be allowed to do that, but it's hard to pass a law to stop that from happening. What matters a lot to me are the people who are developing those policies. Are they also doing that and counting that on the plus side of the ledger? Or are they thinking about trade-offs? And you gave the Ohio example, but just to do the numbers, I don't think it's been published in the NBER working paper series, but it's been published on Twitter about 8 million times. Investment in structures and manufacturing. And it's just this hockey stick. It's going along like this and it goes straight up. And isn't it amazing? You passed all these laws, huge investment. Well, BEA has 6 different categories of structures. That's one of the 6. It hockey sticked up. The other 5 all went down in real terms relative to 2019 Q4. Several of those other ones are larger in absolute terms, and so structure investment as a whole is down, not up, since prior to the pandemic. Now, that doesn't say that these policies are good or bad, but now it says rather than it's automatically good because it created jobs, which actually might be the right way to think about it in a recession, you have to ask yourself, is it better to have more of this type of structure and less of those types of structures? Often the answer to that might be yes. It's better to have structures making duplicative, not quite as good, somewhat overpriced semiconductors than to get them all from one island that's in a particularly dangerous place in the world. And that might actually pass it, but you have to ask that question. And that becomes what Catherine said, the thing that people try to avoid, which is the trade-offs. And then that last part of it, just to sort of, just to restate what I said before, something like the batteries need to come from, be made in the United States. I actually think the White House did understand that clearly. Joe Manchin did not or had an interest that was contrary to it. So he passed a law that had local content requirements. And I think the Treasury went about as far as they could in basically undoing the intent of Congress and moving it more towards the rational free trade direction. So some things people do get right. And I certainly would have recommended the president sign that law, even if I didn't like that provision. It was not the first best, but it was nowhere near the 13th, as low as the 13th best either. But it's not like everything the administration has done has been to just push it in this direction, and the more rational other things have gone the other way. And so it's a little bit of a mixed bag. And insofar as there's a good political argument for that, I'm all for it. Insofar as someone did it because they were confused, I'm less sympathetic.
Okay, it's not coming, I'll just do it this way. So I gave you my little speech earlier about politics is the art of the possible and about third best. I will confess that I have another part of my brain that is very much a first best, what I learned in econ class kind of guy. And for whatever reason, one of the things that stuck with me, just really resonated with me. And someone here can scream out who I should be citing for this, but is the observation that if you get to be the social planner, you need one instrument for every target you have. Anyone? It's a famous result in macro somewhere, but okay. So, but in any case, let's start with the end. The same is true in micro policy as well, right? If you want to accomplish things and you're trying to do first best, and you have environmental goal and a jobs goal and a child care goal and a regional development goal, any normal first best economic model is going to tell you you need at least 4 different instruments to accomplish those. And the political world doesn't necessarily allow you to do that. But that's like the strong intuition I bring to things like this. And I would say in the Biden administration, there were some policies that deviated from that more than I had felt familiar with in previous stages of my career. I have not studied them. I'm trying to be humble about things. I have not studied them. I do not actually have an opinion. I just want to note, and this is kind of the spirit of some of what Catherine was saying earlier, right? There really was an interesting change there of having some policies that had like a high level goal, and then all these subsidiary things built on top of it, which if you're a one target, right, one goal, one instrument, sorry, I was saying it wrong, right? One instrument, one target person, struck me as anomalous. But they may have been a necessary, adjustment to the political times that we're in, or maybe not. Don't have a view on that, but it was for me a real kind of change in the type of policy that was being made.
I wanted to comment on one comment that I think Jason made about the interchange in ideas between Chinese. Right, you said something about Chinese researchers and American researchers. I think sometimes about a comment that John Furman, who I was here earlier, but he's not here now, had made to me a few years ago. I interviewed him for something that I was writing about productivity, about what kinds of policies might help jumpstart productivity growth. And he said to me something like, we shouldn't just be focusing on the US, there are billions of people in other countries. And one way that we should be thinking about improving productivity is making it more likely that the hidden Einsteins in India or China get the nurturing and human capital development that's needed in order for them to grow up to become great scientists and researchers, and that we should be rooting for greater economic development in other countries, and not only collaborating, in terms of research with counterparts abroad, but actively investing in, or at least rooting for, the greater economic development and improvement in educational systems in these other places. And I remember thinking that was a really interesting take on it, because I generally do think about, at least when I've had conversations with researchers about productivity, I think I start from the framework of thinking about American productivity, when really there are spillovers from around the world. And with a more zero-sum approach to international relations or international trade, I wonder if we have boxed ourselves out of thinking about ways to, I realize the relationship between China and the US is unique in some ways, but thinking about ways to encourage other countries to also make these kinds of investments in their human capital and in their R&D.
So one question and then, so sometimes researchers bring kind of a lot of different skills and talents, you know, and, some of them are efficiencies, you know, and our reading ability or others, but, I was hoping that you could each just offer some comments on if you feel like there's one area where more time and attention from economists you feel like would be particularly high value, and just give a few examples that came up in your remarks. So, you know, one is focusing on getting better numbers on core questions. And so, you know, Donald's example of the Congressional Budget Office is putting out, you know, we need better numbers on things like federally funded research, and then, you know, we have a lot of skills and talents to apply to kind of producing better numbers. Another would be putting any numbers on some questions that are actively under discussion in policy circles, but that we're really not putting a lot of attention on. So one example would be Catherine's example of permitting requirements for infrastructure, where I feel like Zach Liscell is doing some really good work. You can point to Leah Brooks and Katie Slattery doing, you know, certain work on it, but really you ask most economists about what they think about permitting requirements, and they say, what's permitting? And I just kind of feel like, how are we so disconnected from kind of that as a topic that is so central to a lot of the discussions that you see? And then the third example, and you're welcome to choose a different example, is just better communication. So Jason, I love your example of teaching and how we teach things, and also, you know, how we engage with journalists, or kind of how we engage directly in doing work, you know, in government, you know, it's so any aspect of those or other things. But, and again, of course, more of everything can always be better, but I'm just curious if you have a particular sense that some area that in particular is high value.
So about a decade ago, and I might be misremembering the story, we ran a seminar series at the CEA, and a researcher came in who had just an amazing paper that looked at basically the length of patent that was left with medical innovations and what that would do, and just gave a fantastic seminar. You know, every question about identification did spectacularly well on. And then I raised my hand and said, oh, we're doing something with biologic drugs and their patent length. What's your opinion on that? And Heidi said, well, my paper was about chemical drugs, not biologic drugs, so I'm not going to answer your question. And I'm like, there's nothing that I really don't care about what your paper was about. That's like the only question that we're focused on right now. And Heidi's come a long way since then. And you know, and I'm sort of, again, a little bit of two minds. Part of me is like, if you know something, don't confuse people by telling them things you don't know and that you haven't done research on. On the other hand, of all the people who were uninformed and ignorant and might speculate outside their lane, probably would have rather had Heidi do that by stretching all the way from chemical drugs to biologics than certainly anyone else in that room. Certainly myself, and just to be clear, I would have been more than happy to speak for as many minutes as anyone wanted on that topic, if no one else had been available to, but would much rather have heard from her. And so I think part of that is, you know, be like a mistake if everyone went out and just did work on policy and did their sort of best guess as to how to synthesize a range of things. You do want to discover new things, but I think you do also sometimes need to ask yourself, even if you don't know something quite well enough to be as sure about it as you are about any of the papers you've written, how do you compare to like the next person that's going to give an opinion on that question? And if you think maybe you're going to be a little bit better than them, to stretch, try to do that and communicate. So that's not an answer to the research question, Heidi, and in part that's because I didn't know the answer to that question, but a way for researchers to get involved and get engaged. Not always, not everyone. I think it's an ecosystem. I don't think everyone needs to do every stage of the ecosystem, but more people stretching and doing more than one node of the pure research to translation to policy to actually working full time in the government, etc. I think would be good. You can correct me if I misstated anything.
So I'm gonna, well, so first Heidi mentioned data, and I just want to say that in addition to, there's lots of opportunities potentially for better data and better data sharing. I feel unfortunately we're also in a world in which actually protecting the quality of data that currently exists is also something that needs to be on the agenda. Right, so there's, concerns about funding restraints causing the CPS to be not as good in the future. There are issues about rising privacy concerns leading to less data or different data being shared publicly. So there are a bunch of issues there, which is while we can aspire to more data, it's a classic thing where some maintenance of data that currently exist and making sure they persist is also going to be a high value. And then other than that, I then want to reinterpret the question much as Jason did. And talk about how researchers can have some impact. And so the first is, and I agree with everything Jason said. So there are enormous, I discovered in Washington that there are enormous career advantages if you want to play in that world of being willing to put a number on something, right? Like there are lots of people, and I will confess I'm one of them, who's like, well, on one hand, on the other hand, and it probably goes this way. But but there are people who make a career of saying, no, actually the number is 2. And
Usually that's for decimal, more numbers after the decimal point.
yes, exactly.
2.638.
And so there's a lot of value, and again, you have to benchmark yourself against, not what you need to be in the AER, right? But what you need to be adding value to the policy process and being better than the people who make up numbers, right? Who also exist. So I encourage that. And then the other way you can have real impact is by bridging the gap from the higher level that a lot of academic research takes place, not all, but the higher level, to the, the thing you need to change is section 45J.I, and, change, the and to an or whatever, like being able to connect it, like you don't have to do like ledge counsel, like actually write legislation, but be able to get down to some granular level where you can have some guidance about, is it a legislative thing or an administrative action thing, and like where in the rules, the regulations, or the code people might be looking to make the change.
So some of my thoughts on this are maybe going to be duplicative of what you all have said, but I do agree that if you turn down a call from a journalist like me or anyone else because you think you haven't done research on the narrow question at hand, there will be many other, not just less qualified, but like people with ulterior motives who are willing to fill in the gap and who will produce an answer that is convenient for whatever organization or partisan side or whatever that they are paid to work for. And there's like a whole cottage industry of people who do this in DC and elsewhere, where they come up with white papers that, they know what the answer is, and then they work backwards toward the inputs or the whatever the question should be. And so if you don't answer the question, somebody else will fill in that gap. I agree with that. But more broadly, I don't know if this is like too logistically small to talk about, but like if a journalist contacts you, just get back to us right away. We're usually working on very tight deadlines. I know in academia, the metabolism is somewhat different, but even just to say, I'm sorry, I can't help you, I don't have time right now, that's very, just so we know. And if you don't think you are the appropriate person to talk with, despite the pep talk I just gave you, it's very helpful for you to suggest other people who you think might be the right, that might have the relevant expertise. And another maybe more small board thing is that sometimes I will like send a question to someone, I'll call someone or I'll write them about a piece that I'm working on. And the reply I get back will be something along the lines of like, your entire premise is wrong. And that is very useful information for me to know. But not all journalists, especially those working with very tight deadlines and turnaround times, will necessarily respond the way you want them to. So that they may just, barrel ahead and continue with the thing that's wrong. I generally recommend that if you think somebody has the wrong premise for their article about inflation or whatever, if you can propose something else that is also interesting, that is a better way to look at it. Like if somebody calls you and says, like, I want to talk to you about how greed is causing inflation, for example, you can be like, that's, baloney. It would be helpful for you to say, well, actually, I don't think that that's quite the way I would approach it, but you could look at X, Y, and Z. You could look at supply chain constraints or whatever. So just like, rather than shutting down an inquiry, providing an alternative route, I think is an underrated piece of feedback that I try to give to academics. And then in terms of specific topics, yeah, permitting, very important, especially right now. There is so little discussion of it, or so little number crunching that takes that into account. I remember somebody telling me like a year or so ago that one of the estimates for how much the IRA was going to increase like wind generation. I'm making up the exact numbers, but it was something like it assumed that wind generation in Iowa was going to increase 17-fold, but about half of the additional wind farms that were assumed to be created were illegal. In that, like, there are setback requirements or moratoria of building and building new wind turbines. And so like it's really hard to get that stuff right, especially in a federalist system. But thinking about those other kinds of frictions is really helpful. I would also say tax incidence. Next year, a large swath of the tax code is going to expire, and there's going to be a huge food fight over it. And there'll be, just as I said before, there will be interested parties putting out their own estimates for what various tax proposals will do, and whether they'll pay for themselves or what the distributional consequences will be. There's going to be a lot of like junk data that comes out, and the more good data that we can get on that, I think would be very valuable for public discourse.
Great. So if you have a question, please go up to one of the two mics and send it over.
Hi, Alex Sapp, IFB. It's been a little bit of a pessimistic conversation so far. Could you talk about potentially how improving the accuracy and productivity, increasing policies in terms of their budget impact might affect congressional negotiations in terms of changing something from something that costs money to get paid for? How might that affect negotiations in Congress and like ultimately potentially change what gets passed? Any favorite case studies or anything?
Could we answer them one by
I
one?
mean,
Yeah, anyway, you go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, Alec, look, I think CBO estimates, they really do matter a lot, and the people who obsess over them are obsessing for very good reason about them. They're not always constraining. So, in 2017, there were senators who said it has to be revenue neutral, and the definition of revenue neutral is 1,500, it's $1.5 trillion. But even that was a binding $1.5 trillion. Certainly with something like the Affordable Care Act, and this would be an example of where economic research really matters. The CBO model was filled with parameters, and there were elasticities from tons and tons of different papers, and we all believed them. And people, we knew it wasn't a perfect prediction of the world, but if it came out with one number or a different number, it had a huge impact on the political ability to do it. I think I haven't done the back of the envelope math on your question, and it's possible someone here has. My guess is if you did the present value of the extra taxes you'd get from the extra GDP from your innovation thing, I'd be surprised if it offset, certainly within the window, I'd be shocked if it offset more than 5% of the cost. If you did present value, I'd be surprised if it offset more than 15%. That's a wild guess. If someone here has a better number, you should correct it. In which case, your $40 billion thing costs $30 billion or something. Would that help the allocation of money? I think it would help it a little bit. I don't know about how much. There's another question of CBO doesn't produce welfare measures. If it produced this 30 billion will make the world this much better, and that 30 billion will make it that much better, and there was some comparable way to do it, could I see that making the world a better place? Maybe. And even the growth estimates worry me because they count $1 from somebody working harder the same as $1 of TFP. And the dollar of someone working harder is worth maybe 25 cents, which was the tax distortion, and the rest of it is the lost leisure they have. The TFP, it sort of depends where the TFP comes from, but it has more of a shot at being worth $1. So I think it's less the feedback into the budget costs, which would be good and welcome, and more, could there be some type of social welfare way of, you're gonna get more if you do this.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is, so there's always, in terms of the congressional process, there's always a question about what numbers they're targeting through legislative procedure and which ones are just sort of out there and influential. And it's often the case that the targeted numbers are what I referred to earlier as conventional scoring, which by construction will often miss some of the dynamic effects you have in mind. Whereas there'll be like an associated study that does the dynamic things that may not have the same congressional rules written about it. Now, obviously that could change in a new Congress and in a new environment, but there's an issue basically about what specific, so CBO can produce myriads of numbers. To the extent that the congressional budget process matters, that usually means that there are like about 15 of them and then usually just about one that really matter. And so a key thing is kind of whether the number that matters includes the effects you want.
Right, but it isn't just the budget number. With the Affordable Care Act, the coverage number mattered an enormous amount. When CBO said this is what would happen to coverage, this would happen to premiums, huge impact. I haven't seen something other than the budget number matter anywhere else. And in part, that's because CBO doesn't do them. So I'd love them. I wish during the Inflation Reduction Act that they had, and here's how many tons of carbon you reduce. And then policymakers couldn't just use their own made up 17 times numbers. They'd have to live with those and could have optimized it better to hit carbon. So producing more outputs than just budget numbers or even than just GDP really could matter and could maybe make a difference for the better.
All right, I've got two questions. I'm happy to decide whether she wants to or vote. First, Catherine, first of all, it's been a delight to listen to you contribute to this panel. Before today, I was not a subscriber to the Washington Post. That's a change.
You tell my boss.
But I'd love for you to try to help me understand how the tone of journalism coverage in your peer newspapers has changed over the past few decades, and in terms of how it contends with economic science and the kinds of trade-offs that you just talked about that would seem to us to be wholly uncontroversial, but now seem to be part of some neoliberal project that's been discarded by so many of your journalism peers. Can you help me understand that? And a question maybe for both Jason and Don. Don, I totally agree with you. The Congressional Budget Office, they're doing the Lord's work in Washington, D.C. It's a really useful institutional structure that disciplines and constraints congressional debate and informs it. In Australia, there's something called the Australian Productivity Commission, which plays a similarly constructive role in microeconomic policy. Thank you for nodding your head, Brian. Could we imagine something like that being constructed in today's Washington? Or am I just some kind of neoliberal fight? Thanks.
You want me to go first?
Yeah.
Okay, so how do I defend or explain my entire industry? So I have a lot of theories about this. I do think it's hard to know whether economic coverage has actually gotten worse since I started out, or it's just like, I think I learned more. And so I'm sure a lot of the mistakes or things that I perceive as mistakes that other journalists may be making today, I might have made as well. I'm not sure I want to go back and read my early work. But I do think my perception is things have changed. There is definitely a sort of anti-neoliberal bias. I don't know what neoliberal means, but I know it's really bad and don't want to be it. And it's an epithet that's wielded. I think that there are a few things that have contributed to sort of greater skepticism of mainstream, for lack of a better word, economic thought. One is that, you know how I was talking before about how there are motivated voices, like very interested in getting their message out, their parties, talking points out, whether it's about, the fiscal impact of tax cuts or investing in X childcare program or anything else. I think it's partly that, and they sort of hacked journalists' brains in a sense, because like they're all on Twitter and they're all very vocal on Twitter and they weigh in on everything right away. Often in very colorful terms. Like there are people whose full-time job it is at some of these think tanks to just be active on social media, or at least to be communicating with the outside world in a way that it is at best a secondary, maybe tertiary, maybe 13th best part of your job responsibilities to engage with people outside of the ivory tower. This is their whole job, is to communicate, and they are pushing a message, and journalists are lazy, and we see people on Twitter saying pithy things about what's in the news. And so there are a lot of voices that I think get elevated because they are available. They're getting retweets. They have a tweet that goes viral, which may or may not be correct. And so some of it's about, another set of voices that are motivated to be oppositional at best to sort of mainstream economic thinking, because sometimes mainstream economic thinking produces inconvenient results. So I think it's partly that. I frankly also think it's like something about the journalistic mindset, which is that we love an underdog story. We think of ourselves as the people who are taking on big authority figures. And so I think personally that that's part of the reason you'll see a lot of sort of glowing profiles of more, I'm thinking about a diplomatic way to say this, of kooks, or at least people who are, what's the term of art? Not unorthodox, say heterodox. A lot of heterodox economists. And I'm not saying all heterodox economists are kooks. Please don't yell at me on social media if anybody's watching this. But I think that that's part of the reason why there's outsized coverage of it, because it's often like framed as such and such a little guy takes on the establishment and proves that everything everyone has ever thought about macroeconomic policy is wrong, or antitrust, or anything else. And so I think it sort of plays into journalistic tropes, and this is not uniquely true to economic coverage. This is like a blind spot I think journalists have on a lot of issues. But as a result of that, I think it helps us, I think it leads to more coverage than there might otherwise be of things that are not like MMT, like things that are not a major force within academia, but sort of get presented in news coverage as if they are. So I think it's a combination of those issues, but those are just my theories.
So I'm not familiar with the Australian example, but just quickly on that thing. So there are three major congressional support agencies that do economic analysis. There's the Government Accountability Office, the Congressional Research Service, and of course the Congressional Budget Office that do kind of analytic support. There was at one time a fourth, the Office of Technology Assessment. I am so ancient that I actually once hoped to work there. It was eliminated in 1996, I believe I have the year right, during the whole Gingrich-Clinton kind of set of things. Maybe someone in the room will remember the history better than me. Just, what I took from that is the technology group, among other things, just wasn't able to demonstrate the same core relevance to what Congress was doing, that it was hard to get rid of the other three, and they produce important, useful stuff for members of Congress all the time. So when the time came to let's cut off something, OTA was on the chopping floor. People periodically discuss in private nerd circles where I travel about bringing OTA back. But it's very hard to see the way to bring back a new congressional support agency that would rapidly have credibility and belief and buy-in from all sides. Not saying it's impossible, but I think conversations tend more today to be, should we ask CBO to do more?
I will say on that point though, I think these advisory agencies or whatever you want to call it, don't really matter unless they actually have some, they have some power. Like, I don't think shaming politicians into creating better economic policies is necessarily going to work. And the only reason CBO is as powerful as it is because of Senate procedure that, some arcane rules that relate to what the CBO score really mattering for how many votes you need to proceed for a bill.
So I grabbed the microphone before you said the shaming thing to say the exact opposite of that. So now let's get a vigorous debate up here. I want to, I'll take the other side on economic journalism too. I think we have the best economic journalism here. Every one of the profiles Catherine referred to drives me crazy. Half of them I see and text to Catherine, the other half Catherine sees first and texts to me. So I'm not debating that at all. But you read the daily news stories about what's going on in the macroeconomy. Those aren't the people they're looking to understand the dynamics of inflation with the Fed, or what's happening in the macroeconomy. There's a lot of people that could read papers more intelligently than in the past too. So I think there is too much of this heterodox subculture, absolutely. But the number of economic journalists that know things really, really well is I think amazing. On this post-neoliberalism, yeah, I think the core issue is if you think all good things go together, you don't need to do cost-benefit analysis. You can just do benefit analysis. And if you're just doing benefit analysis, you don't actually need to quantify any of it because it's going to be positive no matter what. And that's true if it pays for itself, et cetera. I think Republicans have a set of sins too, where they just think this tiniest perturbation destroys economic growth. Raise the minimum wage by a penny or the top tax rate by a penny destroys economic growth. And then you don't do cost-benefit analysis either. You just do cost analysis to say that was a bad idea. So the cost and the benefits and combining them together is sort of unsexy. Now on the shaming, I think it actually does matter. When we did our macro forecast in the administration, a very potent argument would be if we put this number down and CBO has a much lower number for growth, it'll be really embarrassing. Now, to be clear, there were different administrations probably have different tolerance for that forms of embarrassment. And maybe the one after us had slightly more tolerance than we did with their 3% growth forecast. But I think that did have a bit of improve the quality of yourself because you knew it would be checked. Thought it was always a problem on the regulatory side that you didn't have that. You came out with your cost benefit estimates and CEA could argue with EPA, but you knew there was no one at the end of the day other than advocacy groups outside the administration that would have numbers. Yours would be the only number. So there wasn't quite the same, we don't want to embarrass ourselves. So I do think some trying to embarrass yourself type of thing. And CBO does these dynamic estimates of the president's budget from time to time. They started breaking it out. Here's the 8 policies. Here's how much each one does for growth. That would be a small little step. I wouldn't radically transform everything, but it would help.
So we only have 6 minutes. I will ask a 30,000 questions, both on finance, and not in macro, not in productivity. So I don't know if David, who's the other finance person I see here, will agree, but there are 2 views of the world. One is the social planner that it's been discussed here. And in finance, the view could be an agency view where people have their political objectives. And by the way, we in finance are now moving into politics and finance, taking over other fields as well. And so the view is that basically you have your political objective, and then you come up with the analysis that will justify it some way. So the agency view versus the social planner view. We actually had a paper on that. Economists hated it. It was in context of privatization. Finance liked it. So I'm wondering if this panel will, where do you think we are between these 2 models currently, and have things changed over the years that you've been in government? And I will add just one quick comment. I really enjoyed everybody's discussion. I enjoyed Catherine's discussion very much as well, because in another life, I was a tenured journalist in a national network in Israel, and I can tell quite a few stories. So I'll just end with a very quick anecdote. So I was interviewing a guy, high official, responsible for policy in agriculture. That's from many years ago, so I think things have not that changed that much. They had a cockamamie subsidy and tax policy, which made no sense except politically. And when I asked him about it, he says, you know what our problem here is? In Israel, we don't have comparative advantage in anything.
Why don't we take Brian's question too, and then people can choose, how to respond.
Just responded to that. I came back to Australia about maybe 20 years ago, and the Golden Era, which used to be edited by Keith Hancock, who actually was quite a good journalist. I mean, Keith Murdoch, who was the father of another Murdoch, who's maybe not the same category. But there was a request for a tariff by some industry in Australia. And the journalist wrote in the first paragraph, this will cost X amount for the average consumer, right there, so right at the same time. And this was a result of an evolution of something that used to be called the Tariff Commission, which is a commission for putting on more tariffs, and even farmers approved on tariffs on inputs, okay? But over about 30 years, very competent civil servants sort of managed to maneuver all of this, along with some useful politicians, into being the Productivity Commission, which basically was cutting every tariff in sight. And this is just an incredible achievement, and I think may not have gone quite as well recently. But I mean, there is a little story of this by Beth Erskine and somebody else in the book in Australia, amongst other things that got done that seemed to be very difficult. And this is one area I just mentioned now because I haven't been taught anything on this. I know nothing about how this gets done. But I think we should pay attention in cases where things actually do get better for a time, for reasons that people maybe don't clearly understand. But they might understand it a little bit better in some contexts.
And I'll just add one last comment to the mix, and then everybody can make some last remarks reflecting on the questions or anything else you'd like to share. I was in the UK recently and was mentioning something about the 10-year budget window, and there were a bunch of people there reflecting on remembering when they moved in the UK from a 1-year budget window to a 3-year budget window. And it was really striking to kind of hear them talk about how much they thought that mattered. And I think this idea that kind of all the work that we produce kind of gets put through this system that's set up, in a certain way. But, how do you think about kind of the importance of research versus rules and kind of that as a part of the discussion as well? So any comments you want to make at the end, and then we'll wrap up.
So on the agency versus the social planner, we had a choice here. Policy 1 costs $100 billion and it reduces carbon emissions by 10%. Policy 2 costs $100 billion and it reduces carbon emissions by 20%. All else equal, I think most people would pick policy 2. In government, there are some people who would love to know between those two policies what the correct carbon emissions reduction is so that they can pick the one with the higher number. There are definitely also people where policy 1 is this thing that there's this whole group and they love it and they're convinced it's the best thing in the world. Maybe it's recycling or something. And you want to make your interest groups happy. You want to make your constituents happy. And not just, this isn't, by the way, just a purely material special interest thing. This is just the group who really cares about climate change for whatever reason got obsessed with the thing that was 10%, not 20%. Now, this I think gets to the agency versus the social planner. How do you end up making sure you do the 20% one, not the 10% one? I think part of that is the same thing that we've been talking about, which is no one would defend the 10 over the 20. It's just they try to say that the 10 was actually 30. And the more there's a vacuum and an ability to do that, the more you're at danger of the self-interested people that Catherine says that people will call after the person here doesn't return the call, or just wishful thinking or whatever else. So having mechanisms, and in some spaces, I think on the coverage numbers for healthcare, we had that. There were groups that could have told us whatever, but for whatever reason, everyone believed the CBO numbers. In climate change, there isn't something like that. In innovation policy, there isn't something like that. And so I do think that shaming institutional mechanism can make it a little harder for the people who think the policy that gets to 10 is like super sexy and exciting to claim it's 30 with a straight face.
So I also had thoughts on your question about sort of social planner agent, which I took in a different direction, which is, so I think at the risk of speaking for the panel out of turn, I think we would all describe ourselves as kind of representing the evidence-based policy approach to thinking about policy, which is, understand the world, collect evidence, use that to inform policy. It's definitely, and that's kind of a phrase, I mean, obviously that concept's been around for millennia, probably well, at least back to Jon Snow. But not Game of Thrones. If you don't know who I'm referring to, Google Jon Snow. But, for the past few years, it's been, it's been a phrase that's been used, but then of course, the reverse of it has also become kind of a joking way of referring to one of the phenomena you see, right, which is policy-based evidence, which is basically reverse engineering the process to try to find or manufacture support for what you want. There's clearly a lot of that. You asked what I actually think is a really hard question, which is whether it's worse today than it was in the past. It's easy to be a semi-old person today and, oh, it was much better in the past and things today and it's today. But then I think back to like when I started my career doing economic policy in 2002, man, there were people saying some insane things then. A few people are still saying the same insane things. So others may have a view. I'm not sure there's been a trend, but one trend I would notice is that it feels today like there are more sources of claims, more sources of both analysis, and I mean it in the sincere sense, and analysis in the quotes sense, that there are more voices out there, which creates a challenge for how you work through it and the risk of people cherry picking either strategically or just unconsciously.
I wanted to talk a little bit, since it's come up in various forms, about the role of independent agencies and their credibility. Maybe I was too harsh in my comments. I'm somewhat convinced by Jason that shaming does matter, but it only matters if people believe in the credibility of the institution. And there are currently active efforts to undermine the credibility of many of these institutions, including the CDO. I mean, CDO has come under attack whenever it's produced something that's inconvenient, whether it's the number of people who would lose health insurance as a result of ACA repeal, or the cost of any given policy, or whatnot. But it does, to me, it does seem like there is a more concerted effort right now afoot to undermine faith in the CDO. There was a survey that went out from House Republican leadership to members relatively recently, like essentially asking members to give them dirt in the CDO, like, tell us all the times that they got, they misbehaved or whatever. I mean, it was, I'm being flip, but it was basically looking for excuses to attack CDO. There is similarly an effort afoot to rein in the political independence of the Fed. And there are contingents on both the left and the right who want to do that for various reasons. The Trump advisors have made pretty clear that that's what they would like to do. They want Trump to have a vote on the FOMC, essentially. And so there are a number of our institutions that I think are at risk, either at being actively sabotaged, like their funding gets cut, or you may remember when Trump was president, he tried to shove in a question about citizenship on the decennial census that probably would have screwed up the results. Like there were some active efforts to undermine these agencies in terms of their ability to do their jobs, but there's also active efforts to undermine the perception of these agencies. And the more that this community can do to try to voice why it's important to have credible, independent statistical agencies and other agencies that hold politicians to account and give better information for voters, I think the better.
So I'll just say thank you to our panelists. We really appreciate the remarks, and these panels are often kind of highlighted on the feedback that we get as being one of the most useful and kind of generative parts of our meeting. So we really just appreciate your time and thank you for coming. So.